Hello, everyone. My name is Barry Braster, and I'm here to talk to you today about the importance of developing quality content. Brief word about myself. I've been in the technical documentation business for close to 20 years now, and I've done quite a few implementations and managed those that had to do with implementing controlled language or simplified English. So on the left bottom, you can see my contact information. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Now, about today's webinar then, in order to determine what is so important about developing quality content, let's first have a look what quality content actually is. I have a few examples here on the left-hand side. So what it is not is when we communicate to the end users of our products by saying clean the turret dome chassis, thermals, window securing screw, threaded holes in the thermal, etc., etc. It's a very lengthy sentence. The writer was trying to put several meanings, several topics into one sentence using very complex verbs as well as complex nouns. In other words, it's very difficult to understand by an end user, which could be anywhere in the world. That person could not have a technical background. That person could also not be a native speaker of the English language, and therefore it would be very hard to understand. If we then translate this particular sentence from English into other languages, you cannot really guarantee how clear that translation is going to be as well. Another sample is turn off engines not required. It's a much easier sentence, as we can see if we compare it to the other one. But there's a problem with it. Even though from an English grammar point of view, it's fine, it can have two different meanings. It could mean turn off engines is not required at all, but it could also mean only turn off those engines that are not required. So let's say that you have 4 engines, then 2 of them may not be required to be turned off. And then of course you have a bigger problem, let alone if you again translate that sentence into another language, you cannot really guarantee that translation to be correctly translated in the other language. So what is then quality content? Well, content that would be where we apply the 3 C's, as I would like to call it. Content that is clear, concise, and consistent. That needs to be understood by a global audience. In the world of globalization today, we create products that are being used globally. And we have to understand that if we are a writer, we may have a different language, cultural, or technical background. We have to write for our end user who also may have a different language, cultural, or technical background. So, and that's why we need to write for in a particular way. It ensures safe product use, sure, but it also helps to create efficiency in writing, managing, and translating, as well as publishing your content. And if we all then basically use the same rules or use the same terms, terminology, words, etc., then we actually have one voice towards our customers. Rather than calling a component A in manual A and calling the same component B in a different manual. So, and at the end of the day, quality content can also ensure that your content is future proof if we're talking about artificial intelligence and IoT. But I'll talk to you a little bit more about that later in this presentation. First, I want to discuss a little bit about the macro trends that are going on right now. So if we look at globalization, digitization, there's a technology leap, urbanization, demography, energy transformation, sustainability, etc. So if we then take those 4 macro trends and we translate those to what that means for content, then, well, one, it means that if you want to have your product being used worldwide, then you should also comply with global standards that are being used for content like S1000D, ATA ISPEC 2200, outside aerospace and defense, something like DITA, ASD ST100, and maybe there's other style guides that are being asked for, but compliance, of course, is one issue. And we see that in the field of globalization, that there's a lot of Asian companies over the last 10 years or so that have started to globalize their products as well, but that means also that they need to meet Western content standards. And those standards, I've just mentioned a few of those. We see a trend with outsourcing, insourcing as well, but outsourcing content development to best cost countries, which can work, but at the same time, these same standards will need to be met. And if you're moving to a PaaS model, which is a product as a service model, where it's basically in everyone's interest that the downtime of a product is minimized, because in a PaaS model, you do not pay for a product, you only pay for the product's use. Content can also play a very important role there, but also more about that later. Knowledge transfer, we see a trend where a lot of engineers are retiring or getting a little older, and a lot of the knowledge is, well, basically still buried in their minds. And that's something that we need to ensure can also be transferred to the younger, the newer engineers in a way that, well, we need to transfer that knowledge. We need to keep that knowledge within the organization rather than having to ask engineers to come back from retirement and teach the younger folks to you know, how to do certain maintenance tasks. So content, where it used to be mainly about meeting legislation like European and other international directives, because there was a machinery directive, for instance, that stated that we needed to provide our products with a manual. It's no longer really about that. It's really about how to best service our customers. Diving a little bit deeper into any of these, just a few aspects that I just mentioned here, legal requirement. So is there a contractual requirement to meet certain standards for your content when you sell your products? Is there S1000D, or are you being asked to provide ATI ISPEC 2200 compliant content? Are there mil-spec standards? In the machinery industry, there's ISO 2607, which also requires you to have your language written in a simplified way that makes it easier to understand by everyone. Plain language requirements, if you're in the US federal industry, if you will, may require you to provide content against certain contracts, certain legal requirements to produce your content in a certain way. But of course, where do these requirements come from? Well, safety really is an important aspect there. So safe product use, content plays a really crucial role there. I just mentioned a couple of slides ago, turn off engines not required. Well, if that can be a simple sentence that can be interpreted in two different ways, and you're talking about product safety, then you can see how important this particular sentence and therefore content in general can play. I mentioned this earlier already. Content is created by authors who may have a different language, cultural, and technical background. But in addition to that, we not only have writers or authors create content at our corporations. We often see a trend where subject matter experts, SMEs, or engineers are also involved in writing content, or at least coming up with some of these wonderful terms that then a writer has to basically simplify for an end user. That's a process that also is sometimes in place, we see. And engineers are fantastic people, of course, but engineers are not necessarily great writers, just like great writers are not necessarily great engineers. We have to basically take that into account. Content needs to be clearly understood by a global audience. One voice I mentioned, so the use of consistent and clear content will improve your branding. If you buy a product and you want to know how to use it, and the manual that came with it is very big, lengthy, badly written, can be misunderstood, it's in essence going to make your product look bad as well, even though you may have a fantastic product. So create one voice, improve your branding, and by looking at words like some of these: set, run, go, take, and stand, every single one of them has more than 340 different definitions. Can you believe that? So it's also about consistency. If you're going to call something an aircraft, for instance, then you have to call it an aircraft everywhere else. So Metrics, of course, are important when we talk about content. So when you talking about quality content, when you going to be talking more about what standards to apply here, but once you have done so, you can see your translation and localization costs go down, sometimes by up to 30%. You can see your word count go down by 40%, and that's something that I'll talk a little bit more later on when you go through training. Because that can really help you distinguish between the nice to know and the need to know, but more about that later on. Quality improvement, writing and translations, up to 30% in reduced product cycle time is when you have software in place, more about that later as well. 40% reduction in documentation cost, and if you have an SDE requirement, simplified English requirement, then software can also help you with efficiently convert that. But I'll discuss that later on. Future-proof content then. If you have content that is structured, that is written in a simplified way, think of it this way. If you are going to ask your Siri or your Google Assistant or your Amazon Alexa about how to basically do a certain procedure, IBM Watson, I forgot to mention, how to do a certain procedure to maintain a certain aspect, then what you're going to get is not a machine that answers clean the third dome, wishers, etc., the sentence that I mentioned earlier, but it needs to be in clear, concise sentences. So in other words, the way the source was written in the first place is going to be reused later on for artificial intelligence. It's going to help you connect to IoT, because at the end of the day, your machines that are going to have sensors on them that in the end are going to be able to allow you to do predictive maintenance, that mechanic that is being asked to go on site there still needs clear instructions. And you can bring that up by, again, having the source written in a simplified way. In other words, you're making it future-proof, whether you are still publishing to printed manuals or later on when you want to publish as part of an augmented reality project, for instance. That content is still going to be needed. You're going to make information easy to understand, easier to find by your service engineers and other end users for that matter. Now, there's style guides, there's writing rules. The most important one that we promote ourselves is the Simplified Technical English. And on one hand, I'm talking about the specification ASD ST100. But when I say Simplified Technical English, I really mean writing rules that promote clarity, because even the folks at the STEMG, which stands for Simplified Technical English Maintenance Group, did not reinvent the wheel themselves. They looked at what standards were around when they created the specification back in the 80s. And we actually did a study. We compared STE with a few of these other standards out there, or writing guides, and it turns out that the majority of the rules are basically the same. Which is the promotion of writing clear content. So whether you look at the Chicago Manual of Style, which is a very thick book, by the way, or the Microsoft Manual of Style, or the Federal Plain Language Guidelines, these are standards that are around that promote how to write in a certain way. And we're big fans of those, of course. What is a controlled language then? Because not all of these style guides are controlled languages. Controlled language basically is there to help you reduce ambiguity, to improve the clarity of writing, to improve the understandability for people whose first language is not English, to make translations easier, etc., etc. And really, if we're looking at a controlled language, which one is out there, then even though the Microsoft Manual of Style and there's some others have some of these rules, or actually the majority of these rules are the same, Simplified Technical English is really the one that has been around the longest and being used the most for that matter. Currently, as a matter of fact, over 60% of companies that are requesting the STE spec are not in aerospace and defense and are simply using the standards to create clear content. It has about 60 writing rules or so, comes with a core dictionary, and it's an excellent basis for your controlled language needs if you're not in aerospace and defense. And if you are in aerospace and defense, this of course is a standard that you should be aware of. Some of the writing rules then, well, it's about writing rules, one, and it's also about the use of words, the use of approved terminology. And the key aspect, I would say, of controlled language is that one word can only have one meaning. So if we're going to call it one thing, that means that you're going to have to be consistent. The word, where we're going to call it the word aircraft, or if you're looking at a monitor, you cannot really say the display monitor or the monitor display or the monitor displays when display is used as a verb. You can already see where confusion comes from. One word can only have one meaning. And then nouns versus verbs, right? So if I tell you to turn off the light, then most of you are going to know what I mean. But be aware that you're going to have end users around the world that are going to take you very literally. And if you're going to tell them to turn something, they're going to look for something to turn. Well, guess what? That machine didn't have anything to turn. It had a switch on it. Does that mean that we use the word switch from now on? Well, yes and no. Switch, as you probably know, comes from a noun, yet we use it as a verb, right? So what we tend to do when we get used to words is to nounify them. The word Google, for instance, is a good example of that as well. And what we should be doing is to leave the nouns, to basically make the nouns leave them as they are. Don't, let them alone, and don't nounify them, and go back to the use of simple verbs, and then start adding complexity where needed. So as long as, if you're going to use something as a noun, you could no longer use it as a verb, and vice versa. Articles in front of nouns, because when you use nouns, and sometimes they can be used as a verb as well, by putting an article in front of it, it's actually making it easier for an end user to recognize that word as being a noun. Not more than 3 nouns in a noun cluster, because you're going to make things very complicated otherwise. People are going to have a hard time with connecting which word belongs to what other word, and having 3 nouns, so an uneven number, will help that. Gerunds is a nice one. The sample that I always use is the woman hits the man using a hammer. Now, it's not a nice example, but the question here is, who is holding the hammer? Could be that the woman hits the man who is using a hammer, but it could also be that the woman is hitting a man or hits the man with a hammer, right? So in other words, the problem with gerunds is it's not clear who's doing what to whom, and in a simplified way, you want to make people responsible for their actions, and therefore no use of gerunds. Using gerunds in headings, by the way, is okay, but don't do that in procedural text. And then the last one, not one topic per sentence. Now, I mentioned there's about 60 plus writing rules or so, but this is just a summary of some of them. And one topic per sentence is a good one. Just don't try to basically jam several meanings or topics into one sentence. You're going to lose your end user. Just keep it short and concise so that it's easier to understand. Remember, you read something, that is a procedure, you execute, you do that, right? Then you read something else, you do that then. By the time you're at step 3, you're going to have already forgotten about step 1 and 2. So read it, do it, read it, do it. That's kind of the process that your end user follows. Anyway, just a couple of examples here. What we do ourselves at Etteplan is we use STE as a basis. We add customer-specific words on top of that as a dictionary, but we also look at the Microsoft Manual of Style when we do not write for, or when we write for software organizations, and when we need to write, or according to other, sometimes it happens that our customers request us to write a certain way, and then we look at the Chicago Manual of Style as well. So it's all about standards for us at Etteplan. And this is a really good basis for us to create content for our growing number of customers worldwide. Now, implementing simplified English, as I like to call this in general. Simplified is in the name, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a simple thing to do. There's a couple of steps that are necessary for you to take when you start looking at this, or when you start implementing this. Of course, beforehand, you need to create a very clear business case. We can help you do that, by the way, by offering a free content analysis, but more about that later. Is to standardize your terminology and define your style guide if there isn't one. keeping the principles of controlled language in mind. So again, the way you write needs to always promote clear content. And how do you do that? Well, what we do is we go through the documentation that we have. We compile the documents that are a fair representation of the terms that we use on a day-to-day basis, and we extract those terms, and then we do a linguistic as well as a statistical analysis that basically ends up after a couple of weeks with a dictionary that usually has 2, 3, sometimes 2,000, 3,000, sometimes more words in your dictionary. Second part is to train the writers and the SMEs. So anyone who is involved in creating content or developing content requires training. So that, I mean, we've trained over 3,000 writers, I would say, up to date, probably a little bit more by now, but different industries, different languages as their background. But training writers is not just about how to write in a simplified way, but also why these rules are there. What do they mean? So on day one, we go over the theory with our users, with our writers, and day two we basically turn into a workshop by applying the rules to your own content, so that you really learn how and why to write in a certain way, and how to then convert your own content in an efficient manner. It helps to analyze your content, to define a roadmap and milestone, so get a baseline measurement. Where are you today? Create reports. Where are you? How much are you spending on translation costs, for instance? Where are you with regards to a score, right? So we have our software tool that I'll introduce in a moment to create a score, and that tells you how far are you off and what problem areas do you still need to focus on. Having a roadmap like that also helps you define to what extent you can become compliant and what effort is needed to do that. Then our tool, HyperSTE, it assists content developers. It's embedded in the content workflow. It's integrated in your authoring and CMS systems. CMS stands for content management systems, and it helps that way. Having the tool itself is not just it's not going to fully get you there. It's an aid. It's a tool, and tools are there. A tool is not the end goal, right? A tool is there to help us get to the end goal. And that's what HyperSTE does. It's been around since 2002. It supports, it means that it's a plugin to various authoring environments, including Arbitext, FrameMaker, Oxygen, Word, Flare, UltraAuthor by WebEx Systems and Raytheon's Eagle. And it's a content governance platform that helps you create content that is, again, clear, concise, consistent, that helps you being in line with your legal requirements, with your style guide, with your content strategies, and it helps you to become more cost effective. It helps you to create one voice towards your audience. It aligns your global or your local writers with content goals and helps you to create efficiencies. And there's a couple of other things that you can see here, but important to mention that it's available on premise, and we also have it available in the cloud. I'll show you actually right now a little bit about what this is all about. So we have here a Arbitext file that you can basically check with HyperSTE. So it sits on top of Arbitext, but it also supports FrameMaker, Word, and others. And at the end of the day, you can use it as a word-for-word replacement. So it gives you information about the word perform, which is not allowed because you can also say do or execute or etc. etc. And do is the more simpler verb. So in this case, it's easier to do a word-for-word replacement. But you have things like verify. Do we say verify, ensure, make sure, be sure, validate, etc. You can see that if you have so many different words that say the same thing, you have to make a choice. And in this case, make sure that is the good one. There's a sentence database that comes with it. So the idea is that people over time will start reusing each other's sentences. HyperSTE then looks into similar sentences that have a high CR, which stands for compliancy rating. And you can, again, use the tool within your authoring environment. You can create reports. You can do that on one file. You can do that on multiple files. And once those reports are created, they have a timestamp so you can see how content and how documents and writers are doing over time. And then you have here, right here, your ratings, readability, flash Kincaid grade, translatability, similarity, some statistics. And if we want to know more about this score, which is a little over 30%, then we see that there's non-approved words, which are the biggest issue. Then we go to the detailed results. And there's a drop-down menu that we can basically look at words like may are not allowed. May, could, might are not allowed because in some languages, in some cultures, it could mean you have a choice. You can either do it or not do it. Where, for instance, in US English, it means we're trying to be polite. And in British English, same thing, by the way. We're trying to be polite, but this is something you really must do. In other cultures, it means, oh, I have a choice. I could also not do it. And because of that ambiguity aspect, may and could and should are not allowed. Anyway, you can see how many are in there and define what your roadmap needs to be in order to become more compliant. In the cloud version, we have the ability to then, easily manage your users. You can create different profiles that have different writing rules attached to it. All of that is customizable. You can apply conditional checking, which means that if you have a DTD, so if you're working in S1000D or DITA, you can load that DTD and then let HyperSTE distinguish between certain tags. So if you have a tag para, it can basically say, okay, I need to check that against certain writing rules. For instance, it allows you to make that distinguishing. So you have the ability to manage your terms. So in addition to the SDE dictionary, you of course are going to have your own dictionaries attached to it. And there's also an online editor that you can use to check your text against as well. If you click on My Settings, you have the ability as a writer to define that day what rules you need to write against, what dictionaries you need to write against, what conditional checking profiles you need to write against. All of that is very easily something that you can set before you start working, and something that you can also easily create when you are an admin. So anyway, that's just a brief overview of HyperSTE. If you want to know and learn more about this, then feel free to contact me. That leaves me for this particular part of the presentation. So thank you very much. If you want to know more, request our free booklet. It's 112 pages. We only sell ourselves on the last two, so it's actually quite informative. Ask us about the free business case analysis that we can help do. And visit us at simplifiedenglish.com, where you can also look at some pricing plans for HyperSTE that actually starts at €12.50 or $13 per month. It comes with a free 2-week trial, and you have my information right there. Barry.Bradster@Etteplan.com, and my you can in the US you can reach me here. In Europe, I'll be reached at that particular part. And pleasure doing this for you, and hope to see you again next time. Thanks everyone. Have a good day and stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.